Man, this front row is really front.
Yeah,
Too close there, isn't it?
it's an aggressive front row seating.
It's like it's all those straight A students that just want to get double A, A double plus at this point, A triple plus.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so hello everyone, good to see you all here. In the way of announcements, this Friday is our annual Thanksgiving feast. So, yay, it's happening again. It's our, I think this is our 5th annual at this point. But yeah, so.
It was, what was it, 2021 I think that started?
Yeah.
We just gather around an apartment, the office apartment, I think.
Yep. Yeah, that was my first year here. But yeah, so this year we are planning on having it at 6 p.m. Now, currently the announcement that went out says 7 p.m. That is getting moved to 6 p.m. I will send out another announcement on that to make that clear promptly.
I can edit the original announcement too.
Sure. Good. Yeah, but that is it. So it's going to be at 6 p.m. and it is going to be in the Phase 3 clubhouse. Unless it's taken, we're going to try hard to make sure that doesn't happen. So should be the Phase 3 clubhouse. We'll send an announcement if worse comes to worse. And so we'll have our food. Of course, again, this is kind of a potluck sort of thing. So we do encourage, like, just bringing some kind of food. There's a sign-up sheet in the announcements, but again, it's supposed to be Thanksgiving. It's supposed to be janky. You're encouraged not to go over $20. Don't go all out for this. Just get cheap stuff. We're all college students. We're all broke. So yeah, and then after that, I'm sure quite a few people will probably end up going to the BSM game night, which is happening kind of roughly at the same time, right after. So other than that, this is our last normal meeting of the year. After that, next week is Thanksgiving, obviously. The week after that, we're going to have our end of the year party with games and probably some kind of food. Probably pizza. Yeah. We normally do pizza. We'll have something, and that will be our last meeting. But this is our last actual meeting with the speaker. So with that, I will leave it over to our speaker.
All right, thank you. All right, so thanks everybody for having me out for round 2 to speak to you all. This session is essentially a distillation of a bunch of notes that I put together while taking the kind of New Testament origins class through the Bible Project. So you'll see me plug that later. But it really, I think, opened my eyes to a lot of the complexity of the Old Testament. It's really easy kind of over time to take complex topics like the Bible and how it's structured and how it's what its origin is, and really kind of stick them into a box that is very nice and neat and easily understandable. And so what I'm hoping today is that we'll kind of peel back the curtain a little bit on that, maybe show you some of the hairy details, and give you some threads that you can pull on to dig it deeper into that if that's something that interests you. So one of the things that I thought might be fun to start with, and this is a favorite pastime for my wife and I, is a good friend of mine, Michael Murray, bought this for me as a Christmas gift one year. This is just a coffee table book that is this contains a bunch of the draft drawings for the Read the Bible or the Read Scripture series that the Bible Project put out that you may have seen, where they do summaries of individual books of the Bible. But this diagram on the front is something that I like quite a lot because this shows the full structure of the Bible. And it's all color-coded as well. So I'm curious, for those of you who are whiz-bang at your knowledge of Bible books, does anybody think that they can name the pairs here of grouped books? Or name any of the pairs, maybe. Maybe we can work our way through it.
1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings.
Okay.
Second row there.
Yeah, so this is 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So we're halfway there.
Group Chronicles. So
yeah, Chronicles is somewhere else. So one of these down here is probably Chronicles, right? 1st, 2nd Chronicles. There's a fourth one in here somewhere, right?
Would it be Ezra and Nehemiah?
Oh man, I didn't think we would get to that until halfway through the presentation. You're exactly right. This is Ezra and Nehemiah. Actually, this is Ezra and Nehemiah, and these are Chronicles. So, man, that was a really good call out. So yes, you're exactly right. In the Jewish tradition, Ezra and Nehemiah are a single book. So, and I think that that's kind of a really cool illustration that gets us to start thinking about how differently other people view the Old Testament, or what I'll probably refer to mostly here as the Hebrew Bible, since that's kind of a more agnostic name for it that is happy for both Jewish people and Christians, and kind of how differently it's been interpreted over time and how we can learn from that. So let's jump into it. So I think that the first thing that when I'm thinking of the Old Testament, I think a bunch of questions tend to pop up, which are things like, what's going on here, right? Why do we even need an Old Testament when it's so much harder to read? You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes. It can be really dry and really boring. Why does God seem to alternate between being really gracious and merciful in some spots and being vengeful and deadly in others, and sometimes they're only a couple of verses apart, right? So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Where is God's goodness when an entire society of people is wiped out, like we see in a lot of the portions of Joshua, where they just wipe out a whole town? Why can't I get life applications out of the verses very easily? You know, it's not always easy to be reading your way through Numbers and then extract how it applies to your life, right? So, and this is the interactive bit. Why does Christianity have an Old Testament at all? Does anybody have a thought? Because in the early church, they actually intentionally chose to keep this portion of the Bible with the New Testament, right? So does anybody have any thoughts on why is there an Old Testament included in your Bible? Why did early Christians think that that might be important?
Yes, prophecies on the upcoming Jesus.
Okay, yeah, prophecies.
To understand how Christianity has evolved over time.
Okay, maybe some of its history, yeah.
Considering that the New Testament probably would it start after Jesus? It would technically, right?
Yeah, depends on how you define started, but yeah. It was certainly transcribed, written down kind of after Jesus' time for the most part.
And even beyond prophecy, there's patterns and imagery in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills and sort of is the culmination of.
Yep. Yeah, I think those are all great answers. So there's a lot of importance in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible, and we're going to look kind of at how did people in Jesus' time view this collection of books? What did they get out of it? Why did they consider it to be so important? So I find that when we're going through the Old Testament, there's often a couple of what one might call Christian coping strategies that people employ to make it nicely palatable, right? And so one of them is that they use the hero or example model, which you can see with my childhood Bible man here, which I can say that I had a Bible man cake growing up, and I had the VHSs. They're awful. So, for example, Jonah and the whale. This is a fantastical story where a prophet of God tries to run from his destiny and is swallowed by a fish, forcing him to go to Nineveh and tell them about God, right? But what that leaves out is that Jonah was so determined to disobey God that he almost got an entire ship's worth of people killed, and in the storm that was representing God's fury. And then even after he finally goes to Nineveh and preaches to the Ninevites, he ends up so angry and disappointed that God showed mercy to them when they believed, that to the people that he hated so much, that he begs God to kill him, right? So that's a different story from what we have here. Yeah, and that's very different from the way that we might describe this story if we read it to our kids, right, or something. And so people often will try to put that story in a box. What about Samson? Samson is a real-life superhero, right? He fought like a whole army of men. He got tricked by a wily woman into losing his superpowers when she cuts his hair. And at the last moment, God restores Samson's strength so he can destroy lots of enemies, right? But what this leaves out is that his hair was a representation of his dedication as a Nazarene, or as a Nazarite, I should say, from birth, and that over his entire life he had been trashing his vows, and that was the last symbol of his loyalty to God. And he fell in love with a pagan woman and let her basically ruin that portion of his life too, right? And that he cries out to God and kills himself along with a bunch of people at the end. And lastly, King David. King David is an iconic godly person. He's humble, he's compassionate, he's sacrificial and brave. He even killed Goliath, right? But he also lusted after another man's wife and got him killed to hide the fact, right? So you know, it's okay. There are some exemplary people in the Bible that you should, you know, model some of your character after. And I think they're meant to be an example. But using the Bible as a repository of examples is going to lead you to a bad place. The second one, the answer book model. This is the Dwight Schrute version. So the Bible is a dictionary, and the narratives are like your dictionary illustrations, right? So the issue here is that this can make you become very, you can clash heavily with other people, other Christians that are of other denominations, when you find out that they have a dictionary that doesn't exactly line up with your own, right? Because it's the place where you go to get your factual answers, and their facts don't match yours, so they're wrong, right? On the other hand, you know, maybe it should inform our lives and be a source of knowledge and wisdom, and it does make real claims about the world that we live in. But if we treat that as its sole purpose, then we're going to be pushing people away over tiny things that don't matter, right? And finally, the inspirational heartwarming model, which I have a picture of all things, the Queen of England and apple pie. This is meant to represent the phrase motherhood and apple pie, which I actually had never heard until I was an adult. The phrase motherhood and apple pie means this is something that everybody can agree on is great, right? So people will use the phrase motherhood and apple pie when it's like, we don't need to rehash this whole thing. We all agree on it. It's great. You know, we don't need to sit here talking about it. And so what happens with this is that people will they'll pluck out some nice little verses that are super inspirational, and they'll put them on a sticker or something. And then, you know, life is good because, you know, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And, you know, there's no understanding of the context or why that was written or anything like that. It's just it's an inspirational saying, basically, that just happens to come out of the Bible. All right. So we've talked about a couple of things of what the Bible, and especially the Hebrew Bible, is not, right? It's not the hero example model. It's not the answer book model, and it's not the inspirational heartwarming model. All of these things are good. These are all things that we can and should be able to use the Bible to do, but it's not those things, right? If we put it into that box, we've narrowed it down too much. It's too reductive, right? So then, how did Jesus and his apostles view the Bible? So I know that this is just a wall of text, but bear with me here. I'm going to read through it really quick. So this is from Luke chapter 24. It says, "Behold, on that day, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, which was 60 stadia from Jerusalem." So there's a couple of guys. Jesus was just crucified. They're traveling down the road. And lo and behold, they're talking about these things that had taken place. Like, man, it's crazy. This guy, Jesus, got crucified. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you're exchanging with one another as you're walking?" And they came to a stop, looking sad. And one of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you possibly the only one living near Jerusalem who does not know the things that happened here in these days?" And in a really lovely turn here, he says, "What sorts of things," right? And they said to him, "Those about Jesus the Nazarene, who proved to be a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, how the chief priests and their rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened, but also some women amongst us left us bewildered. When they were at the tomb early in the morning, they did not find his body, and they came saying, 'We've seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive.' And so some of these who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the woman had said, but him they did not see. And when he said to them, you foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and come into his glory? Then beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he explained to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures." So in particular, I want to draw your attention to the end here, where it's referencing the Hebrew Bible. So the term Old Testament didn't emerge until the 3rd or 4th century after Christ's death, or after Christ's birth, I should say. It's not a title that the Hebrew Bible gives itself. That is something that it was pasted on by the early Christians. Typically, it's simply called the writings or the scriptures when they're referring to it as a whole body, like it does here in all the scriptures. It's also, there's a couple of phrases that Jesus uses to refer to the Old Testament, and they have evidence as being formulaic sayings that are meant to describe this particular set of books and not just any set of books. And that's where it's talking about, beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, right? So things like this phrase here, Moses and all of the prophets, or Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, things like that. These are phrases that are used in the New Testament, and when those things are said in that order, in that combination, it's specifically referring to the scriptures. So it's specifically referring to the Hebrew Bible. So keep in mind that kind of 3-part thing that we're talking about here. We'll come back to that in a second. So just like these 2 men who are on the road to Emmaus, they find out there's some ways of reading the Bible that reveal its truth, and some ways of understanding the Bible that do not reveal its truth. It's important that we leave behind our assumptions and try to come into it with an understanding of what the scriptures are trying to communicate, and then we're going to get the message, the intended message from that author. All right. So this was something, it looks like my formatting didn't quite come through here, but this is something that we mentioned earlier. This is alluding to the fact that the Hebrew Bible is a repository of patterns and themes, right? So specifically, Jesus is saying, hey, remember all this stuff that Moses and all the prophets talked about? Remember all the scriptures that you studied as you were growing up? These are patterns, these are archetypes that are pointing specifically to me, right? All right, so one more example of this is in Paul's charge to Timothy. So he says, you, however, continue in the things you have learned and become convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings, again, which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. All scripture is inspired by God and beneficial for teaching, rebuke, correction, and training in righteousness, so that the man or woman of God may be fully capable, equipped for every good work. So here, Paul is describing the scriptures as something that gets handed down from generation to generation, right? It's something that you learn from the old people before you, and they learned from the old people before them, right? So in this case, the Hebrew Bible is wisdom literature that we're supposed to be thinking about continuously, that we're supposed to teach to the next generation, and they're going to teach to the next generation. And it leads you to an understanding that there's a Messiah that rescues us from our sin, right? So these 2 excerpts are just kind of alluding to some of the ways that people in Jesus' day were viewing this body of literature that we now call the Hebrew Bible. So what exactly is the Hebrew Bible? What is this conglomeration of books that we have arrived at today? It is a minority report. So this was something that for me was kind of significant because I'd never really thought about it before, but when you're reading through the Hebrew Bible, you'll notice that it pretty much is always written in opposition to the current authority, right? This is something that's been handed down by many generations as something that was not the majority view. It was a perspective of this small fraction of Israelite society and their recordings of Israelite history. And as soon as we come out of that context, we'll lose that message. And I'll give you some justification for this in a second. That this essentially was a line of Mosaic prophets in the tradition of Moses, who are preserving this kind of kernel of truth amidst the largely apostate Israelite society. All right, so I mentioned earlier that prophets were anti-establishment. This is the first Google image that came up when I Googled for a Jewish hipster. So I just threw it in here. But it's essentially, as you're reading through, especially a lot of the prophets and Samuel, you'll find that it's very suspicious of Israelite institutions of things like the monarchy, the priesthood, and the quote-unquote official prophets. And the reason that is in quotes here is because, the monarchy especially understood that if you have a prophet that declares that it's God's will for you to do the things you're doing, you can actually kind of get away with it pretty well, right? And it specifically calls out other prophets and says, all those prophets that are sitting in your courts and telling you, tickling your ears and telling you all these things you can do, those are not the real prophets, right? So again, this kind of alludes to the fact that this is a minority report of these, this core group of prophets. This is a smattering of verses. I didn't want to read through all of these, critiquing specifically the monarchy and the prophets and saying why these are terrible. And it might bear thinking also here about how dangerous it is in a Bronze Age society to be critiquing the ruler publicly, right? And in fact, late in the Israelite monarchy, they completely lost the covenant texts, and they got rediscovered later, which you can read about in 2 Kings, where they go, wait a second, we lost part of the text and we just rediscovered them, and it's a big huzzah, where they get discovered by a Moses-like king and interpreted by a Moses-like prophet. So this is kind of a literary tool that's using, where if you read through it, you'll see, man, there's a lot of connections here between the personalities of these characters that are being described and this Mosaic tradition over time. So it's also kind of important to note that the Babylonian exile was a pretty significant event in Israel's history, and what were the elements that were wiped out by that? It was the monarchy, the priesthood, and all of the court prophets, right? So when God is saying, we're going to send in all the Babylonians and they're going to clean you guys out, it didn't wipe out the true understanding of God's word, but it did wipe out a lot of this other nonsense that was cluttering up the scene. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit more into the mechanics of the text itself. So which books were they talking about? It turns out that there's a lot of Bibles out there. This is just showing you how different traditions in Christianity often add or subtract different books from the Hebrew Bible, or things that might be called the Apocrypha, or they get various names. But so then this kind of begs the question: what is exactly the set of books that they were talking about? Because even today, there are lots of different understandings of what the Hebrew Bible is and means, and they all approach it differently as a result. So the kind of alluding back to what we saw earlier, this is a comparison between the present day Christian ordering of the Old Testament and the Tanakh ordering, or the current Jewish ordering of the Hebrew Bible. And what you'll see here is that there's actually quite a lot of differences, but there's a three-part structure here to the Tanakh. It's divided into the Torah, which is the law, the Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which are the writings. and the prophets are subdivided into the former prophets and the latter prophets. So when we're talking about the Tanakh, the reason it's called the Tanakh is really just because we took the beginning consonant sound from each of these and just crammed them together. So it's T and K. You'll sometimes also see it written as capital T, lowercase a. Oh, actually, I have it right here. Capital T, capital N, capital K. And to me, this was actually a pretty big revelation because this primes the idea that maybe there's something important about the way that these books are organized. And you can imagine that if you have a book that you're reading and all of the chapters are in a different order, you could come away with a very different understanding of that book than you would if it was in a different order, right? And so I don't know that we have full evidence that the ordering of these books looked exactly like this in Jesus' time, but we do have evidence for Jesus referring to it in these three broad categories of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So you'll see that as far as a common question here is, well, how do we end up with that, right? If this was what it looked like back then, approximately, how do we end up with this? And the answer is we really don't know. At some point in the early church, the entire Old Testament got reshuffled and reorganized into these things. And this is not a bad way of organizing it, right? I mean, this does make sense. We have the Pentateuch and the history and the poetry and the prophets and everything. But I just realized I left Deuteronomy out here, sorry. But we don't actually know exactly where this ordering of the Old Testament came from. But we do know that the early church was not interested in its Jewish origins, which we'll talk about more in a second. All right, so a little bit of evidence for this Tanakh-like ordering of the Hebrew Bible. This top one we've already read through, so Moses, the prophets, and the things written in the scriptures, right? That's the three-part thing we mentioned earlier. Luke 24:44, they mention the things that are written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So what's the largest book in the Ketuvim? It's the Psalms. So it's a part standing in for the whole there. In Luke 11, this is a really sneaky one. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the house of God. This is not the prophet Zechariah, if I back up here. So you'll see Zechariah is here in the middle of the Tanakh. It's like, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But there's actually a guy named Zechariah who's killed in 2nd Chronicles. And so saying from the blood of Cain to the blood of Zechariah, and who is killed between the altar and the house of God, he's talking about the entire compendium of the Tanakh, right? So that reference makes a lot more sense when we understand that Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. Some other things. External evidence. Yeshua ben Sirah. So this was a Jewish philosopher, or sorry, not a Jewish philosopher. He had recorded some of the teachings of, I think, his grandfather that had been passed on to him. Yes, grandfather Yeshua. And you'll see that he references the many teachings that have been given to us through the law, the prophets, and the others that follow them, right? So that three-part structure. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which we're going to talk about in more detail in a second. There's part of a letter that was sent by the priests at Qumran that specifically references the scrolls of Moses, the words of the prophets, and David, again, who's associated with the Psalms. Primarily, it's David. And then lastly, Philo of Alexandria, who is a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria. And he wrote about the laws and oracles given by inspiration through the prophets and the Psalms, and other scrolls whereby knowledge and piety are increased and completed, right? So there's a lot of different ways of kind of talking about these things, but there's this consistent understanding that there's these sections of the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms, or sorry, the writings. All right, let me see where I am. Got to make sure I don't run over my time. This is like a whirlwind tour, so I'm sorry I'm jumping around, but hopefully this is coming through. So let's talk about how Jesus and people in Jesus' day would have actually encountered the scriptures. So what this is on the left side, this is actually from the trip that my wife and I took 3 years ago to Israel. And what you can see here, this bottom large picture, these are the ruins of a real synagogue from the 1st century in Magdala. And this was there was essentially a Catholic hotel retreat center that was built, and as they started excavating it to build the foundation, they discovered these ruins. You can see across the top, this is just more for interest than anything else. You can actually still see mosaics that were on the floor. It's that well preserved. But this is actually the setting in which Jesus would have heard the teachings on the Hebrew Bible, and in which others would have learned about it as well. It was extremely rare to encounter a complete set of scrolls representing the Hebrew Bible outside of either a synagogue or the temple. And the whole idea of reading it to yourself didn't exist, right? Most people were not literate at the time. It was read publicly in the local synagogue. The first book didn't exist yet. That was not introduced for several hundred years. And so the way to think about this is that the Hebrew Bible existed as something in your mind or in your culture more than a physical book at that time, right? So I'll let you guys come see this. You're welcome to come take a look at it afterwards. This is a Jewish study Bible. This is a Bible that was translated, the Hebrew Bible, translated into English by the Jewish Publication Society. I bought it because I just thought it would be really cool to see what do Jewish people, what do those Jesus people think about this? What are some ways that Jewish people kind of look at the Hebrew Bible differently from Christians? And it is in the Tanakh ordering. So so it's important for us to keep in mind that this is part of why a lot of the scripture talks about keeping the word on your mind and in your heart, right? It's not because it didn't exist as text to them. It existed as something that you like mutter to yourself as you go about your day, to think about it. That's why it's wisdom literature. It's something that you literally repeat to yourself, and you hear it and you rehear it and you discuss it with other people publicly. And that was how the Bible was. The Bible has a much longer history of being taught like this than it does the way that we currently teach it in our churches, right? So this idea of somebody who would just stand up and read a whole section of the scriptures and then just sit down, and all the guys are going to just talk about what they got out of that, right? So from around the second or third generation of Christians through the next millennium, only a handful of scholars had any interest in studying the original Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible. Instead, they would rely on translations into other languages like Greek, for example. In fact, it would have been an embarrassment for a medieval church typically to be associated with the Jewish tradition at all. It was not until the Enlightenment period and the Reformation and everything that came after that that people said, wait a second, maybe we should be looking at the original text here to see what that was saying. So unfortunately, that's a big black spot on Christianity, that it separated it was so divergent from its Jewish roots. Sorry?
Why was that?
I don't know the full reason. I think it's largely because Christianity took off so much amongst Gentiles, and that there's even to this day, there's a large cultural separation between Jews and Gentiles, right? I've actually lived in New Jersey in a town that was about 50% Jewish people, and I have a great story where I lived on the same street as a sushi restaurant, and my parents came to visit me. And I was like, we should go eat sushi. We all like sushi. So we walked in the sushi restaurant, and everybody in there was Jewish, all of them, including the owner. And so it was like, I mean, you could tell immediately because everybody's got yarmulkes on. All the women had long skirts and everything. And so it was like, well, this is weird, but Jewish sushi is better than no sushi. So we said, how long is it for a table? And the owner said, I don't know, we're pretty full. And we said, well, that's okay. We're willing to wait. How long do you think it'll be? And he said, I don't know. It's It's, they all, all our tables are pretty fresh. And so we ended up leaving and going somewhere else. But there is still a pretty thick divide between Jewish people and Christians. And what you'll find actually is that Orthodox Jews don't think very highly of Christians because of a lot of the racism that they were shown in this period. They still do not view Christians very well. I know that that in particular has been used as a justification for why they spit on Christians in Jerusalem. So they say, it's not, it's such a cultural element to them. It's not like a hate crime or something, So that's so that there's no love lost between those groups of people. Yeah.
And I think it's gotten better in the recent,
Yes.
last 50 years or something.
Oh yeah, we're much better now as a society than we would have been back then. That, like I said, back then it was like embarrassing to be associated with the Jewish tradition at all. But nowadays there are still detectable cultural rifts, but obviously we don't like separate ourselves from them. So, and obviously the study of the Bible has come a long way, and we have a much better understanding of the Jewish tradition there. So what about other writings of the time? So after the Israelites were exiled to Babylon, Ezra and Nehemiah tells the story of this remnant that returns to their homeland. They build the second temple, and it's not as great as Solomon's temple, but this lasted for about 500 years and later was destroyed by the Romans. And this period is, there's a lot of commentary that comes out of this period that's called Second Temple literature. So the Jewish society was very diverse. There were lots of different opinions, kind of like you might think of us having lots of different denominations of Christianity today. There was a lot of commentary that was written on the Hebrew Bible then. And in fact, we'll talk about this in a second, but the Dead Sea Scrolls was an offshoot of the temple, of priests in the temple that said, we don't think you guys are doing all the priestly stuff right, and we're going to go make our own little monastic group down here. And that happened in like 1st or 2nd century BD. So the Second Temple literature is largely inspired by and written in response to the Tanakh. And if I back up actually for a second here, a lot of these other books that you see in the Old Testament that are not included in the Tanakh, but are included by other Christian denominations, these are typically Second Temple literature that they just consider to be important enough to include with these other things. So some Christians would say they're divine, others would say they're not, but the point is that's what a lot of this stuff comes from, is it's other Second Temple literature that people decided really belonged with the rest. So, all right. So this time was critical for shaping Jewish writings and culture, and it was during this time that the Ketuvim was produced. So the Tanakh was completing its construction around the time of Jesus, as well as the Christian New Testament. So you could think of the Christian New Testament as a part of the Second Temple literature, really, or at the very, very end of it. This picture on the right here, this is from the Dead Sea Scroll Museum, again from our trip to Israel. This is a miniature, not a real thing. But this is just showing what the temple, the Second Temple, looked like in its day. This is a model. This is what would have been the Temple Mount and the temple on top. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So again, in the early 200s or the late 200s or the early 100s, there's a division in the Jewish faith over how the liturgy and the calendar and the sacrifices are supposed to be run. The group that dissents gets kicked out, and they grab a bunch of scrolls and they leave, and they go down by the Dead Sea to a site called Qumran, where there's lots of ruins today. And they also produced their own literature and commentaries. So they also were later destroyed by the Romans when they sacked Jerusalem. And the prevailing wisdom right now is that they got wind that the Romans were coming, and they stashed all of their scrolls in jars in these caves, like what you see here. This is a huge cliffside, by the way. It looks kind of small here, but this is like an enormous tundra. and hid them away so that they would be preserved. And they were later discovered by sheep herders, goat herders, who herd goats in these mountains. And it actually became public because there was a posting put in the New York Times to sell them. Because they thought it was just a random historical artifact that they had stumbled across, and then people went, wait a second, this is like really important. So the oldest scrolls of the Hebrew Bible come from Qumran, and they're fantastic examples of pre-Christian biblical scrolls. So with that, I need to switch to my thing here. So I had an interactive thing. If anybody wants it, I can point you to it. If you Google the Great Isaiah Scroll or the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's an interactive browser where you can look at these scrolls. You can scroll through them, and if you mouse over them, it actually will tell you exactly what chapter and verse of Isaiah you're in. Isaiah is a complete scroll. We have the entire book. So there's a couple of things, though, that I want to draw your attention to here, and that is, first of all, we're thinking about the Bible as a collection of scrolls, right? Obviously, for the layperson, it exists in their mind and their culture, but physically, it is written down on these scrolls. Scrolls were made out of papyrus or leather. These in particular were made out of leather because that was more durable. This scroll was one of the first to be discovered, and it's complete. The priests who lived at Qumran understood the Bible similarly to how Jesus would have, but they believed that the figure bringing the whole story to culmination was somebody called the teacher of righteousness, who just so happened to be the person who founded their order. So they had the same section of scriptures, but a different interpretation of it at the time. So some interesting notes here. First of all, this is the end of the scroll. You can see the end is in very bad shape because you would typically roll and unroll it right from the end. In fact, if you go to the far other end, you'll notice that there are some places where the writing actually has faded and they rewrote parts of the scriptures to keep it fresh. Some other things are, if you look over here, you'll see there's actually writings in the margin. So there are two scribes who wrote who transcribed the Great Isaiah Scroll, and one of them followed up after the first one did and filled in places where they had missed a section or had forgotten a piece or skipped a line or things like that. And so you'll see places where there's text in between the text or text written down the margin, and that's what that is. You'll also notice that there are some words that are marked with dots. And at the moment, our best understanding of those is that those were records of variances in the text. So if I have two scrolls that I'm copying the text from, and this word is different between the two scrolls, I would mark it with dots. And these markings could survive for multiple transcriptions as a record of any differences between the transcription over time, right? This is kind of the physical understanding of how the Bible would have been written, transcribed, and subsequently taught from these scrolls. All right, so with that understanding, that kind of lends us to say, well, if it's organized like scrolls, it's going to have some different properties from a codex or a book that we read today, right? In particular, if you're going to be reading a scroll, you kind of need the beginnings and the ends of the scrolls to have some marker that helps you to understand where what is this scroll, right? Where do you go if I made it to the end of the scroll? Where do I go to continue the story, right? What are the other scrolls that are connected to this scroll? Things like that. And so what I'm illustrating here is that you'll see that I've divided the Tanakh into 4 sections, or 3.5 sections: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, but the prophets are split into the former and the latter. And we're just going to do a quick little exercise here to look at what are all of these bordering sections of the scrolls to see. Let's look for some intelligent life of how these things were connected together literarily. All right, so this first one, this is from the very end of Deuteronomy. I know this is, again, a wall of text. I promise we don't have too much reading left to do. So this is from Deuteronomy chapter 34. Moses is at the end of his life. He's encouraging the Israelites to go do great things. And the Lord says to him, this is the land I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there's this plot thread that God promised the land to their ancestors, and we're picking that up and carrying it forward now at the end of the Torah. I'm going to give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not go over there. So remember, they had a very long detour through the wilderness because they did not obey. 40 years they were stuck there, and anyone who was, in that original group was not allowed to go into the promised land. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab in accordance with the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab opposite Bet Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. So that's a really interesting verse. Does anybody know who the Torah and Deuteronomy are attributed to? Who? Moses, right? That's an interesting thing to be in a book that was written by Moses, right?
Prophecy is on death.
Yeah. So that's, we'll just file that away for a second. So he's buried. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days, and the days of weeping came to an end. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. And the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord commanded Moses. Since that time, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, who the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all his land, for all the mighty power and the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of Israel. And that's the end of the Torah. It's like, man, that Moses was a great guy. We haven't had any more of those, So let's just pause here to look at this. Who is speaking here, and where are they speaking from? I guess we don't know their name, right? But where kind of in time are they? Where's their perspective?
So right at the boundary of the promised land, right? Because Moses didn't go into it quite yet. So
Yep. Anybody else? Any thoughts? So they're looking back on this, right? They're looking back actually with at least enough time that we're saying, since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, right? Like basically to this day, we have never seen a prophet like Moses. That's interesting, right? So this is kind of evidence of intelligent life here that we'll see in a second. So let's hold on to that, right? This also kind of alludes to, who comes after Moses. It's going to be Joshua, right? But Joshua isn't the prophet who's going to come after Moses, right? He's Moses-like. He's got some great qualities, which we'll read through in a second. But he's not the prophet. He's not the next Moses, right? So let's look at Joshua 1. So it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. The Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. So now arise, cross the Jordan, you and all the people, to the land I'm giving them to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your footsteps, I've given it to you just as I spoke to Moses. So remember, we've crossed over here. We're in a completely different section of the text now. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even as far as the great river Euphrates, the land of the Hittites. So just like we did up here, we're saying like, look out over the land. All this stuff is going to be yours. Only be strong. I will not desert you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous. Be very strong and courageous. According to the law, which Moses, my servant, commanded you, do not turn from it to the right or to the left, and so that you may achieve success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that's written in it, for then you will make your way prosperous and you will achieve success, right? So very obviously it's saying Joshua is like Moses, right? But he's not this guy like Moses. And what do we know about the whole story of Joshua? Joshua does a lot of great things, and then he blows it with the Gibeonites. And so you kind of get this sense that, like, man, Joshua is a really great prophet. He did a lot of things like Moses, but we've not had a prophet in Israel like Moses who could talk to God face to face, right? So let's hold on to that for a second, and then we'll go to the last two here. Malachi. So remember the law of Moses, my servant, the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I'm going to send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers back to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so I will not come and strike the land with complete destruction. So this is interesting, right? We're saying, remember the law of Moses. We've connected that theme, the very end of Malachi, with the very beginning of Joshua, that the law is this meditation literature that is healing to the land, right? Does anybody remember the story of Elijah? What were some of the things that Elijah was famous for?
Praying that it would rain again,
Yeah.
or that there would be a drought before it too.
Yeah. Does anybody remember, was there a...
Didn't he compete with a bunch of false
Prophets of Baal.
Yeah, the prophets of Baal, yeah. So let's do kind of a compare and contrast here really quick between Moses and Elijah, right? So here we're talking about Elijah, before we're talking about Moses. How did Moses die? Kind of mysterious circumstances, right? He kind of just went up into the hills, and who knows exactly what happened, right? How did Elijah die?
Chariots of fire.
he didn't die.
He didn't die, right? Mysterious circumstances again. You know, all the prophets are like, we're going to go over there. Elijah didn't get caught up by chariots. We're going to go find his body. And Elisha's like, you're not going to find his body. And then they go search, and they're like, yeah, we didn't find his body, right? What about a mountain, right? What was the significant mountain that Moses had a big experience on? Does anybody remember? Mount Sinai. That was, so the Sinai covenant was brought down with Moses. We mentioned earlier, what was the significant mountain for Elijah? It was Mount Carmel. That was where he defeated the prophets of Baal. What did Moses build at the bottom of Mount Sinai? An altar of 12 stones. What did Elijah build on Mount Carmel when he was challenging the prophets of Baal? An altar of 12 stones, right? What did, and what's another name for Mount Sinai? It's Horeb. And so where does Elijah go at the end of his life, or at the end of his time as a prophet? He goes up on Mount Horeb, and he experiences this big storm, but unlike Moses, who got to see God's glory, he doesn't meet God there. And eventually he just has a break with reality, and God says, he says, I'm the only prophet left. And God says, no, there's about 7,000 left, and also you're relieved of your duties, right? So these are very opposite characters that, Moses is kind of held up as like the great prophet. But, we've never had this prophet quite like Moses. And Elijah very much parallels Moses' life, right? Even if he's not the prophet to come after Moses, but he's outlining a job description of someone who's going to come, who's going to be the prophet that comes after Moses, and the person who reunites Israel, right? So now, lastly, we can talk about the Psalms. Psalm 1 and 2, I didn't put the whole thing on here because I'm just trying to spare you guys from even more reading. But Psalm 1 is all about the person who follows the path of the law of Moses is blessed, very much alluding to the anointed one, the Messiah. And Psalm 2, the one who follows the law of Moses perfectly, is the new David. He is the king, right? So there's so much interconnectedness between these four locations in the Bible where it's making it like painfully obvious, hey, these prophets, they're doing an important task, but there's another prophet that's coming who's going to be even better than that, right? And there's, in the Psalms, it's outlining what is that person going to look like? What's the job role that they're going to fulfill? Oh, man.
Are you going to tie that into the New Testament?
Well, so there are, there's, I don't think I have, I don't have a specific slide on it in the New Testament, but there are specific locations in the New Testament where they reference Psalm 2. Like Jesus himself quotes Psalm 2 to say, out of the mouth of children, my kingdom is being established. And he's specifically saying, that's about me. That stuff that David wrote that was about God is about me, right?
I was also thinking in terms of the transfiguration. And
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that.
Elijah and Moses were there, and they went on a mountain.
Yeah, the significance of specifically having Elijah and Moses there, and that it's on a mountain. See, you're catching on. Or maybe you already knew. You're way ahead of me. All right, so kind of starting to bring this home. The way to think about the Hebrew Bible, I think, is really like the family quilt. So there's been material that has been painstakingly preserved from one, baloney, my notes just left me, from one generation to the next. And they're made with pre-existing materials, which could be individual stories like Ruth or Esther or Job, or with smaller portions of quilt, like the laws at Mount Sinai or the big collection of the Psalms or things like that, right? And so this final quilt that we get gives all of these individual pieces a new contextual meaning, because you now have this larger context that you view them in, where you can read them as an isolated book, but you can also read it in the context with all of this hyperlinking that's going on with all of the other books, right? So the books, as I was alluding to earlier, these books are associated with authoritative figures that are most relevant to the story and to the preservation, but the primary focus is on content, right? So obviously, there are some pieces of Deuteronomy that were not written by Moses. That's not the point, right? The point is that it connects us to this through line that goes all the way through the Tanakh, that there's this outline of a Messiah who's going to come. And they're not concerned with, well, there's a couple of verses that that maybe weren't exactly penned by Moses, right? So as a result, when we're studying the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible, we need to learn to see both the large scale and the small scale context. So some of the stuff we've done here looks at that large scale context. How are these things connected book to book to book? And then we also can look at the isolated story of Ruth, for example. And Ruth is a really good example because if you read the beginning and end of Ruth, the beginning says, in that day, the judges were around and there were no kings in Israel. And then at the end, it ends with a lineage of David. So it just slots in really nicely between judges and kings, right? But in the Tanakh ordering, that's not where it goes. It goes next to Proverbs. And that helps you to see a hyperlink where it talks about how Ruth is a woman of valor, which is a phrase that's only used in 2 locations in the whole Hebrew Bible, and that's in Ruth and in Proverbs. And so the fact that those books are adjacent draws your attention to that in a way that you wouldn't see it otherwise. So there's lots of different interconnectedness here, lots of signs of life, as Tim Mackey likes to put it. All right, so last topic here, the inspiration of Scripture. Oh man, I'm coming up on time. So I'm gonna speed through this stuff. This is the main idea that I wanted to communicate here is that when we talk about how about the connection between the divine and the earthly, what we see is that when people are writing Scripture, they're very much in control of themselves. They're writing beautiful poetry. It's not like what some people might say, like Mormons, right, or like Muslims, where they say, well, they went into a trance and they wrote out the Scripture, or they were told exactly what to write. There are some cases where that's done in the Bible, but that's pretty few and far between. Most of the time, it's people just reflecting on what's going on, right? And so, there are, this is alluding, in my mind, to this understanding that the Scripture was constructed as a collaboration between God and humanity. And we shouldn't think about it in the deistic way of God creates the universe and sets it spinning and then leaves and has, maybe a miracle or two where he like pitches something over the fence, right? because this is something, when I learned about deism, I was like, man, those old crusty people believing in deism, those were weird, right? Like a couple hundred years ago. But in fact, deism actually has had a very profound effect on Western culture and the Western understanding of the relationship between God and humanity, that God is over there and that heaven is a place that's somewhere else, right? Things like that. And the biblical writers did not view it this way. When they're talking about Genesis, they're talking about a place where God and humanity is together and where heaven and earth are together, right? So in fact, it looks something a lot more like this, where the Bible is produced at the intersection of the two things, just like Jesus is the intersection of these two things, and just like the way the world is created is the intersection of these two things. And it was written as a collaboration between the Spirit of God and the image of God, which is us. And so this also informs how we understand the Bible, because when we read it, it's kind of mediated through the Spirit of God, who gives us new understanding, because it wasn't only written to the audience 1600, gazillion years ago. It's also written to us today. And so we can get things out of it by understanding what they were talking about back then, but also through the influence of the Holy Spirit who speaks to us today. All right, so I'm going to just end it there. Here's a conclusion slide. You can read it yourself. Like I said, a lot of this came from the Bible Project's online class on the Old Testament. I highly recommend it. It's free. You're self-paced. If you have any interest in all of these many, many threads that I just introduced to you today, and you want to go pull on that particular sweater, then please go show that some love and do their class. And with that, I'm done. And you're welcome to pepper me with questions if you have any. And also, you're welcome to come check out the either of these two books as you wish. So yeah, any questions or thoughts? This is like, there's a lot of processing internally on my part, I think, to help me understand how different the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible is from what I just kind of assumed it to be over time. And so if you're leaving feeling a little uncomfy with that, then let it sit for a little bit. That's okay.
More curious than anything, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. That's good.
When you said coffee table book, do you mean the book the size of a coffee table? That was really my first question.
Yeah, well, any book that's that size is a coffee table book, because you just can't be like going around. You can't fit in your backpack, right? Yeah.
Knock you out.
Yeah.
Where do I find that actually? Is it on Amazon?
This?
Yeah.
This book? That's a great question. I've never gone looking for it because, like I said, it was a gift to me. I would.
Surprised if it wasn't.
I would bet you can get it on their store or on Amazon or something like that. Yeah. And by the way, this I got at Barnes & Noble. So you can find a lot of Tanakh Bibles online. A lot of them have Hebrew in them, which I was not particularly interested in because I don't know Hebrew. And I specifically wanted a study Bible because I wanted them to put commentary in it, because I wanted to see what does Jewish commentary on the Jewish Bible look like, right? Just so that I could compare and contrast. So that was why I got that particular edition.
Did you do a lot of study among different alternatives that fit that, or?
So in general, I think pretty much the accepted English translation is this one by the Jewish Publication Society from a Jewish perspective. So it was more about looking through all the different kind of editions to figure out which one fit what I was looking for the most. So,
Okay, cool.
oh, that's good timing now that I'm done.
Actually, I did have another question.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a lot more books that, words in like other things other than the Orthodox Bible, like
Yeah.
because like what we have is in some particular denominations of Christianity and all that. Is there a lot more that we should probably take into account at least?
Yeah. I think that, so first of all, a lot of the books that people even would try to sub into the New Testament, like the Gospel of Judas and things like that, those are also portions of Second Temple literature, right? That doesn't mean that they belong in the Bible, but that whole movement, I think, is interesting for us to look at. They're informative to help us understand what people were thinking about during that time. So all that is to say, there's lots of important books that were not included in the Bible that we could go look at. They may not necessarily need to be part of the Bible. So I don't know if that answers
Many
your
of them have
question.
historical value, but
Yeah, yeah,
be a little careful necessarily.
yeah.
trusting all
They
of
may
them.
not necessarily agree with your theology.
It's just making sure that we have clarity on what the Bible is.
Yeah.
in general.
Yeah.
Does that, what does that include? Does it go beyond the 39 the Protestants accept, or?
So the Tanakh, so all of those, that slide that showed all the
They group them
extra.
a little differently, but just counting that, like,
Yeah.
does that include any of the?
So all of the extra books are added by Christian denominations. So all of these like the Esdras, the Judith, Maccabees, all that stuff that was added by Christian denominations, that's not part of the Tanakh.
That's what I thought. The Jewish community
Yeah.
that produced them didn't take them themselves as scripture.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so the Protestant Old Testament is the same collection of books as the Tanakh, Jewish Hebrew Bible. Yeah, just in
I
a
didn't
different
realize
arrangement.
The Mekwabayan, however you say that at the bottom. Edition.
Well, I don't know anything about the
I've never even
Orthodox
heard of
Tewahedo Bible, right?
Yeah,
So,
that's interesting.
and this just happened to be the most succinct graphic I could find that showed a bunch of this stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
But
Like
yeah,
the Old Testament really does differ, but the New Testament is
largely the same typically, yeah.
largely the same.
Probably because of the homogenization that was provided by the Council of Trent and the Catholic, originally all the Christians were Catholic, right? So it was a lot easier to say this is what it is. So, yes, sir.
I was going to ask kind of tangential, but with the notion of like, at the end of Deuteronomy or whatever,
Uh-huh.
Moses clearly didn't write that, given that he's dead.
Yeah.
It's about, what did you say, like the idea that like, well, if Moses didn't write that, maybe he didn't write the rest of it. Maybe it's something like the documentary hypothesis of like it's a bunch of different sources that got cobbled together.
Yeah. So I guess in my mind, the important piece is less who wrote it and more what the content is, which is not a very satisfactory answer in an apologetics group. So I have to admit I don't know. I've heard of those theories before of like the different manuscripts that may have been combined to form the Torah, and I think that in my mind, we could even say that would be evidence of some of the things that we're talking about here, where maybe these were collections of old stories that have been pieced together by these Mosaic prophets. But I don't know entirely what the specific evidence is, extra Tanakhian evidence is for like the Torah in its completeness was written by Moses, right? So I don't know if I can speak on that too directly, but I know what you mean.
I think we can say that the documentary hypothesis has a lack of like hard evidence for it. It's very speculative. It's not like you found these documents that were totally different and signs of them being spliced together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, because I've heard of it. I don't really know a ton
Yeah.
about it, but like the stuff that I'm seeing in it is like, I don't know, thinking that like these fragments and stuff, the parts that the Pentateuch is made of only go back to like the earliest one, the Yahweh source, only going back to like 950 BC. So I guess that would be like, saying, well, they're much later than what Moses was writing as. So
Yeah.
I guess with like since that time long ago with Moses, as it kind of implies here, maybe someone could use that to point
Right.
to that. I don't know. As you were reading through that, I was kind of thinking in my mind, I'm like, I guess that's what people point to for stuff like the documentary.
Yeah.
Hypothesis of like, oh yeah, look at this. This was clearly written a lot later.
Yeah, I can say that I think, I guess the thing that I came away with is that the way in which the Hebrew Bible was constructed is a lot more complicated than what I originally thought. And what exactly that means is not fully worked out for me. So I can't say too much one way or the other, but on that particular
We lack
topic.
Specific, I mean, part of the problem is, well, you go back that far, right? Like what documents survive, what would be expected to survive.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a few documents I think really live on. I think there was this one time we did the Reasonable Faith. We were talking about Plato's Republic actually,
Mm-hmm.
and how many copies of that really survived over the centuries. Actually, we compared it to the Bible, which had substantially a lot more. There were some differences, sure. It
Yeah.
just goes back to the scroll of Isaiah. To be fair,
Mm-hmm.
the entire book of Isaiah is in that one scroll, and you could tell it's a bit worn. But they
Yeah.
did what they could to just make
It
sure
matched
that was-
quite well. I
Yeah.
mean, there was a few
It's
little
int-
differences, but
Yeah. It's interesting that in the 2,200 years from the Isaiah scroll, or no, 280, right? Not 200 BC for.
this was actually.
This was BC.
This
Yeah.
was BC. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2,200 years between the Isaiah scroll and today, it changed extremely little. It does seem to
Right.
reasonable to say that in the 700 or 500 years before that, between actual Isaiah being written down in the scroll, probably
Yeah.
didn't change that much either.
Yeah, and that was part of the way I think about that also is that in the time of the ancient Israelites, kind of like today, you guys are all really bright people, right? Who are probably in all sorts of very high-tech majors and things like that. And we as a society view you as the up-and-coming people of society, right? Who are gonna build tomorrow. And in their society, the people who were the next generation that are supporting their community were the people who could memorize the whole thing beginning to end, word for word, right? So like a whole culture that's oriented around verbal recitation of the entire text, right? So, I mean, that alone, I think, tells us something about how well that's going to get transcribed from generation to generation over long periods of time.
Just let it change willy-nilly and
Yeah.
start splicing things together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was not an accidental process.
Do you have a personal preference on the Tanakh ordering or the current ordering of the Hebrew Bible?
I don't know that I have a preference, but I would say maybe I have a mild preference for the Tanakh ordering, mostly because all of my life, up to maybe just a couple of years ago, that was the Christian ordering was the only one that I knew. So now there's new territory to be found where you look at it with a completely different arrangement. And so in my mind, that's the final frontier or whatever, the next frontier is kind of re-examining a lot of that in light of this different arrangement.
Yeah, that was new to me to see some of those connect. I really like that a lot. So
Yeah.
Thanks for that. I guess we're about out of time here at this point. Huh?
Yeah. So I appreciate the time that you guys all spent with me. Hopefully this, again, was helpful to you guys. This is a process of understanding the Bible and understanding how the Hebrew Bible fits in with the other scriptures that we have. But it was something that was really significant for me, kind of learning about all this stuff. And so when I was invited to speak, I was happy to kind of try to percolate all my notes down into something to share with you guys. So hopefully it's been something helpful for you. So
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we haven't had enough about the Old Testament.